You close the bathroom door. You lock it, even when you live alone. Nobody taught you to do that. It's instinct, the need for one room in your life where nothing is watched, judged, or reported back to anyone. For an English king, that room didn't exist. Not once. In over 400 years. Someone was always there, watching, helping, wiping. And by the end of this, you'll understand why the men who did it weren't degraded by the job. They became some of the most powerful people in England. One of them used that power so well, it got him executed. For most of human history, privacy was a luxury most people never had. Small huts, shared beds, no doors that locked. But you'd think a king, a man with an entire castle to himself, would at least get this one room alone. He didn't. In fact, the closer you were to the king's body, the more powerful you became. And nothing put you closer than this. The job had an official name, Groom of the Stool. That's not a joke, and it's not an insult someone made up later. It was a real royal title, listed in court records for centuries, and men fought to get it. Here's what it actually meant. The king didn't use a normal toilet. He used something called a close stool, a wooden box built at sitting height, with a hole cut into the top, and a pewter or earthenware bowl fitted underneath. For King Henry VII, one surviving 1,497 supply order describes his close stool covered in black velvet and trimmed with silk, with 2 pewter basins and 4 yards of tawny-colored cloth kept beside it for cleaning. This wasn't hidden in a back closet. It sat inside the king's private chambers, and the groom of the stool managed everything about it, the water, the basins, the cloth, and the king's body while he used it. But that's not the strange part. The strange part is what this job turned into. A historian who has studied the Tudor court in depth, David Starkey, summed it up in one line. The groom of the stool had, in his words, the most menial tasks imaginable, and yet his standing was the highest. Read that twice. The most humiliating job at court came with the most prestige a commoner could get. Why? Because proximity to a king's body meant proximity to a king's secrets. Think about what happens in a truly private room. You talk differently, you worry out loud, you let your guard down, because you assume nobody's listening. A king had almost no space like that except this one, with this one person standing in it. So the groom of the stool didn't just manage a toilet. He managed access. He decided who got near the king and who didn't. Under King Henry VII, a man named Hugh Denys held the post and used it to help run the king's private finances, not because finance was in his job description, but because he was already inside the one room where the king couldn't pretend to be anyone but himself. And Hugh Denys didn't just get influence out of it. He got rich. By the time he died in 1511, records show he owned at least 4 manors, country estates most noblemen would need generations of war and marriage to acquire. He got them by controlling the king's privy purse, the private stash of royal spending money, that had nothing to do with the official treasury or the men who ran it. Nobody voted him that authority. He simply never left the room, which raises a question nobody likes the answer to. Was this job about hygiene at all, or was hygiene just the excuse to get someone permanently inside the king's guard? Let's reconstruct what a morning actually looked like. Henry VIII wakes in his private chambers. Nobody outside those walls sees him yet, not the court, not the ambassadors waiting downstairs, not the wife he may or may not still trust. The groom of the stool is already there. He brings the basin, the cloth, the water. He kneels beside the closed stool while the most feared man in England does something every human being on earth has to do. And he doesn't flinch, doesn't comment, doesn't look away in disgust because his entire value depends on acting like this is the most normal moment of his day. He watches the king's body for anything the royal physician needs to know, what he ate, how he's sleeping, whether something is wrong before the king himself has said a word. Then he helps him dress, piece by piece, choosing what the most powerful man in the country will wear to be seen in an hour. Then he walks out of that room holding more real information about Henry VIII than the entire royal council combined, and none of them will ever know it. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. There's still real historical debate about exactly how far the physical duties went, whether the groom actually wiped the king himself, or simply managed everything around that moment. But that debate misses the point of why the job mattered. Whether his hands touched the cloth or not, his eyes were in the room. And in a court built entirely on secrecy, who was allowed to see was the only currency that counted. By Henry VIII's reign, this had stopped being a toilet job in any meaningful sense. The men who held the title William Compton, then Henry Norris, then Thomas Heneage, then Anthony Denny, functioned as something closer to a personal secretary with total access. Henry Norris was close enough to the king that he knew Henry's private doubts, his moods, the things he said when no one official was around. Norris used that closeness to build genuine wealth and status, land, trust, a seat near the throne that most noblemen spent entire lifetimes trying to earn through war. The evidence for this is buried in the paperwork historians still have. Later, When Henry VIII was deciding whether to end his marriage to Anne of Cleves, it wasn't his counsel he confided in first. It was Thomas Heneage and Anthony Denny, the men who dressed him, who watched his body every morning, who already knew more about his private doubts than any ambassador in the building. A king can hide his feelings from a room full of nobles. He has a much harder time hiding them from the one man who's already seen him at his most exposed every single day for years. So ask yourself what that actually means. The job title said toilet attendant. The real job was something closer to this. Be the one person a king cannot perform for. And then archaeologists and historians found something that shouldn't fit the story you'd expect. That same closeness killed him. In 1536, Henry Norris was arrested, accused of adultery with Queen Anne Boleyn, and executed. Historians still argue about whether the accusation was true. But here's the part that matters for this story. Norris didn't die because he was some minor court nobody caught in the wrong place. He died because he was too close. Close enough that when Henry VIII turned paranoid, the very intimacy that made Norris powerful made him a threat. The job that put a man inside the king's most private room also put him inside the blast radius of the king's worst suspicions. But that's not even the strangest part of this story. When a woman took the English throne, the job didn't just get handed to a woman doing the same tasks. It got erased and rebuilt. In 1558, when Elizabeth I became queen, the office of Groom of the Stool was replaced with a new title, Chief Gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber, held by her close attendant, Cat Ashley. A century and a half later, under Queen Anne, that same inner circle power belonged to Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, one of the most politically influential women in early 1700s England. Different names, different centuries, same underlying rule. Whoever stood in the room nobody else was allowed into ended up holding real power over the monarch's decisions. The job didn't survive forever, though. Over time, it drifted from toilet duty into wardrobe management, then into pure ceremony, a title with no real function left. When Edward VII became king in 1901, he simply stopped appointing anyone to it. 400 years of English monarchs who never once used a bathroom without someone else in the room, and then, quietly, the tradition just ended. So here's the twist underneath all of it. You assume the throne meant privilege, rooms of your own, doors that close, space nobody else got to enter. For an English king, it meant the opposite. The higher you rose, the less of your own body belonged to you alone. Every function of it, sleeping, dressing, eating, this became something managed, witnessed, and recorded by somebody else. Because a king was never fully off duty, not even here. You, sitting there right now, have something Henry VIII never had for a single day of his adult life. A locked door with nobody on the other side of it. You probably don't think about that as a luxury. You should. Somewhere in a Tudor palace, a king who owned entire counties, who could execute a man with a signature, who had more gold than most countries in Europe, that same king could not sit alone in a room without another human being standing 3 feet away, watching. Compare that to your own life for a second. You might complain about how little privacy you actually get: a phone that tracks your location, an app that listens for keywords, a boss who can message you at any hour. It feels invasive. But notice what you still control that no king ever did. You choose who's in the room. You can mute the phone, close the laptop, lock the door, and for a few minutes, actually be alone with your own body and nobody else's opinion of it. A king traded that away the moment he put on the crown, and he never got it back. Not at breakfast, not at bedtime, not here. The device in your pocket is watching data. The Groom of the Stool was watching a person in real time, with nowhere to hide from the noticing. You lock the door tonight, and it won't be because you have anything to hide. It'll be because you can. Whatever people imagine a crown actually buys you, for 400 years of English history, it never bought that.